Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and this week on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast, we continue our talk with Christiana Hale, author of Deeper Heaven, a reader's guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy, sometimes referred to as the Space Trilogy, plus scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this.
Hey guys, this is Ashley Cox from Fangirling Over Jesus. At FOJ, we believe in hope and light in the darkness and that you are not alone. We seek to unite and celebrate the intersection of the gospel and our favorite fandoms, and we get to do this through our social media, our podcast devotional, and our cosplay and fashion. And you can find links to all of that through our website, www.fangirlingoverjesus.com, through our social media at Fangirlingoverjesus, wherever you get your podcasts, and on Etsy. See you online.
And lead me on to your kingdom come, surrendering, let your work be done. My life I give for the glory of your Son.
Thanks so much for listening to the Christian Nerd Unite podcast every week. Recently, we helped launch the Christian Nerd HQ podcast network. The network releases content every weekday, Christian Nerd Unite on Mondays, Tatooine Sons with David, Jesse, and his sons BB Nate and Samuel the Hutt on Tuesdays, Fangirling Over Jesus with Ashley Cox that you just heard from on Wednesdays, The Reverend and the Reprobate with Lucas and Danley on Thursdays, and the Speaking Nerdy podcast every Friday with your host Mike Schilling and myself. Go check out ChristianNerdHQ.com to follow all the podcasts, and check out the Christian Nerd HQ YouTube channel for exclusive content we're making together. Let's get going with some scripture. Mark 10:42 through 45. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slaves of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Jesus gave his life as a ransom. There are many biblical allusions in C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, and the main character is named Ransom. And in the book Perelandra, the second book in the series, the character that is basically representing Jesus says he's also called Ransom by some. The idea of a ransom is fascinating to me. You know, in the police procedural shows I really enjoy watching, there's often a ransom request, a sum of money paid to set a captive free. And that's exactly what Jesus did. He offered himself up for us, taking our place, paying the price for us, a price that we couldn't pay ourselves. I pray that you'll take a moment this week to contemplate the price that Jesus paid to set us free from sin and death, and that you'll consider who needs to hear that this week and share it with them. Now, let's do some nerdy news. Barbie and Oppenheimer take first and second place for a second week in a row. Barbie adding $93 million domestically this weekend, giving it a worldwide total since it opened of $774 million. And Oppenheimer adding $46 million domestically for a total of $400 million worldwide. The new release this weekend, Haunted Mansion by Disney, comes in third with $24 million domestically. Last week, we saw the biggest box office weekend in over 4 years, and this weekend is the second highest box office in almost a year. It's unclear if this is the start of theaters seeing a real comeback, or if this is just a temporary blip. We'll have to wait and see what the strike will do to box office returns in the near future. At Sony, it appears that the strike has started affecting release dates. Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse has been removed from the spring 2024 release schedule and has not gotten a new date yet. The Gran Turismo film has been pushed back to the last weekend in August as the studio reorganizes advertising events with no actors available to promote the movie. Kraven the Hunter has been moved back almost 1 year and now will be released August 30th, 2024. Expect to see more of this from other studios in the next month or so. Back in December 2020, Disney announced a Donald Glover-led Lando series. The Hollywood Reporter confirms this week that Donald Glover and his brother Stephen Glover will be writing the series. It's unclear when this changed from the original writer, but has actually been true for months, but was not revealed until this week. Some reports state that Justin Simon, the originally planned writer, found out he had been replaced on social media posts rather than through official channels. Hopefully, this will not affect the project. I look forward to seeing Glover reprise his role as Lando Calrissian. Last week, we started the first part of our interview with Christiana Hale, writer of Deeper Heaven, a reader's guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. So let's get right into the second half of our interview.
So really, Ransom kills the devil, but that's
Yeah.
another thing. But Divine from the first book actually is Lord Feverstone in the third book. So he does come back. So there is sort of this thread of, even though Weston is gone, Weston's ideas, his philosophies, his vision for reality are still well and alive in the NICE through Lord Feverstone and through the other people that are clearly still proponents of Weston's ideologies, right? So it's still the same enemy in a way. It just looks different. It's in a different form. It's definitely more of an organization, less one man. And so it does feel and look very
and an organization that you instantly know is evil because it's named Nice.
Yes. I have a feeling this is not accurate.
That is one of those that is one of those things where I read Lewis and I'm like, really we're gonna go there. Okay, we're gonna go there. All right,
all right, what's funny is there actually is, you could Google it, there is an organization in England that's, the acronym is NICE. It's known as the NICE. So I believe it began after Lewis wrote this book, but it's not, it still is there. It's existent today. So
That's
it's something
funny.
about, I can't remember what it stands for exactly, but there is, and you think you guys need to read more books if you think that's a good name for your, it's been ruined forever.
Oh my
by
goodness.
Lewis. So,
along with that, this book, that Hideous Strength, gets kind of weird. Not kind of weird. It gets really weird. Because we have Merlin of all things appearing.
yes.
And Ransom can talk to animals, and it kind of goes in a whole different direction.
Yes.
So
And
talk to us a little bit about that.
yes, so there are a couple things. I think it does feel very different, and it does go in a different direction for a couple reasons. One is that Lewis became really good friends with Charles Williams, who was himself an Arthurian scholar. And Lewis, at least in my opinion, I think he strikes me as the sort of man who is interested in everything. There's really, and if someone else is interested in something, that makes him interested in it. And he's not just a little interested. He's like full on, he's like those people who's like, oh, I see a crocheting tutorial on YouTube and now I must crochet everything. I'm going to, I'm going to be the world's best crocheter. And then they move on to the next, right? There are people like that. And I feel like Lewis was sort of like that with academic pursuits. Like he just would get excited about something and really interested in it. So that definitely colors that third book. The fact that he became good friends with Charles Williams. He was fascinated by the Arthurian legends. He already himself obviously was well educated and knew about the Arthurian side of things, but it's sort of it's a new thing, right? And so he's diving into that, giving a stab at it. But beyond that too, I think when we recognize the underlying cohesion of the medieval cosmology, that is
Mhm.
that's the map of the world that Lewis is using when he's writing this trilogy. Merlin and all these things that come out in the third book all have their place in that medieval cosmology. And so it's
Right.
not actually crazy. It's not actually really disconnected from the first two books. It feels like that. And I think Lewis himself would say, of course it does. It's on Earth. It's not on Venus. It's not on Mars. Of course, there's a different
Mhm.
feel. There's a different atmosphere. You are literally breathing a different
Yeah.
atmosphere. And so, of course, it's a different book. But there is this thread that connects all of them. And I think that thread is found in the idea of the medieval cosmos. So Merlin himself has a place in that cosmos. He is connected to that world that Lewis is drawing from. The fact that Ransom is talking to the animals and the animals have an important part to play in
Mhm.
this book is also a very key feature of medieval cosmology, because you have this idea that all three, the medieval cosmos, there are three different elements, if you will. There's
Mm.
earth, air, and ether. And you have these three regions, right, of creation, basically. And they also believe that there's nature abhors a vacuum, right? So that these regions are all full. They're filled with certain creatures, certain beings that live there. So Earth is the realm of humans and men and beasts, basically. We
Mm.
share the same region. Ether is past the moon. That's where the angelic beings dwell. And then air is sort of this in between, kind of weird in between kind of space. And so that's where they put things like the fairies and earthly spirits and what they would call demons, which is not the same thing as devils at that time. We tend
Mhm.
to think of the word synonymously. Demon and devil is the same thing, but in their mind, all devils might be demons, but not all demons are devils, right? So they're
Yeah.
actually, demon is more just like a kind of a category of fairy. Really, it's a
Mm.
creature that's not a beast and it's not an angel. It's something in between, right? So in that world, so that you have those three areas, and so it makes total sense that in the third book, when we're on Earth, you have the battle comes down to people from all three regions, right? You have the
Mm.
beasts that are involved. You have the Oyarsaves of the planets come down and fill
Mhm.
Merlin with their power. So that's the ether. And then Merlin himself is the son of a fairy in medieval legend and medieval cosmology.
Mhm.
So he is that middle in between element joining
Mm.
heaven and earth. Basically, he's a bridge between the two. And so that's the role that he is playing in that book. And so it makes sense. Merlin actually ties this all together and makes sense in the medieval cosmology. Now, again, if you are thinking of this book as a hard science fiction book,
Mhm.
it makes no sense at all. And it feels really, really strange. So you're
Yes.
like, what is going on? This is not what I signed up for. But if you realize that, Lewis is not actually, this isn't hard science fiction. It's more like, well, for one thing,
Right.
it defies categorization really in a lot of ways, but it's more
Yeah.
like if a medieval man was writing a science fiction book, right?
Yeah.
He's writing about the heavens, he's writing about space, but in the mind of a medieval writer, with that conception. And it ends up to us feeling almost more like a fantasy,
Mm.
less sciencey and more fantasy.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just fascinating to me, and I do think that the more you unpack the medieval cosmology, more and more of the elements that seemed very strange and out of place in the trilogy start to kind of come into focus, and you see how they fit
Mhm.
together and make sense. And somehow they still work, right? It just doesn't seem like they should work, and
Mhm.
yet they somehow do. It's kind of like Father Christmas in Chronicles of Narnia and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You're like, I don't know why it works. When I was a child, though, I didn't question it, right? It just made sense. And it's only when you're grown up that you're like, Father Christmas, really, in Narnia?
Yeah, there is that.
Yeah.
I will say, I wish I had a book like yours when I first read the Space Trilogy. I think I would have had a better appreciation for it. as I was reading it. I think it would have felt more connected, like you said. What do you think overall for either the individual books or the series as a whole? What do you think that Lewis is really wanting to communicate overall to the reader?
That's a really good question. I think the biggest thing, and we've already touched on this a little bit, is reawakening our imaginations when it comes to looking at the way we see reality. He speaks about this a little bit more detail in The Discarded Image, which is more scholarly work about the medieval cosmology that he
Okay.
wrote. And if you want to understand more of what the medieval cosmology is all about, that book I highly recommend, The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis. So, but he talks about this is one of the key features that I think he loved about the cosmology so much was what it does to our imaginations and what it does to, as it works on our imaginations, what it also does then to our emotions. How do we feel when we go outside on a clear, really clear night and look up at the night sky? What do you feel? And his argument was that as a medieval man, you would look up and you would feel tiny but secure. You would be like looking up the side of a vast cathedral. You're looking up at something that's tall and vast and huge, but created and full of life and light and vibrancy. And yes, you would feel tiny in comparison, but it'd be this sort of awe and wonder and security. Like, God has placed us here. And yes, we're at the bottom of the totem pole here, but we're secure in that. And then a modern man, though, frequently looks up and feels exposed, right? You're looking up into this emptiness. And yes, it's beautiful, right? A lot of us, we see the stars and we think it's wonderful and it's beautiful, but we call it space. It's empty and it's dead. And there's this sense of almost awe, but also fear of, we're just, what's even holding us on to this little planet? We're just spinning through this vast, infinite universe that's just empty and void. And it can be terrifying and also a little bit unsettling. And so Lewis is arguing that the medieval man had something a little more right than modern man in terms of just how they imagine space, and then what that imagination has, the effect that imagination has on our emotions and what we feel to be true. And that there is, even though, yes, there are things that weren't technically true about the medieval cosmos, he even says in The Discarded Image, there's only one problem with all of this. It's not true. Right? It's not. It's scientifically, we've proven it wrong in so many ways. But what is true about it, though, that we have lost in finding out more about how the cosmos actually is? Well, we've lost the idea that it has been created, which is huge, right? What effect does that have on what you see when you look out at the night sky, knowing that everything you see has been crafted by a personal loving God versus it just exploded out of nothing? And what does that have? What effect does that have on then how we feel, our emotions as we see that? And so he very clearly was very passionate about the effect that literature can have on how you see reality and then how you feel about that reality. And I think he saw the weight that the medieval cosmos can carry. It has so much to offer. It can carry the weight of a worldview, a complicated worldview. And yet when you infuse it through a story, through a plot, through literature with these characters, you almost don't even notice that weight. You're just enjoying it and realizing that there's a lot of richness there. And it does have an effect on your worldview and how you see reality. And I think, again, the number one thing would be, where did all this come from, and what does it mean, and is it just matter, or is it more than that? And that would be the temptation to see it as meaningless, or matter and just matter and no spirit, is the temptation that Lewis was fighting against in many of his works, not just the trilogy, but that really comes out clearly in the Ransom Trilogy, and I think that it comes out very effectively too.
And you, I'm trying to remember this in your book, and I cannot recall because I don't have enough. Even though I've read the trilogy multiple times, I can't confirm whether this was just a quote, something you quoted from someone else, or if it was a quote from C.S. Lewis, or it was an actual quote from the book. But you say something about uh, the problem isn't that it's not real; it's that it's not real enough, and it was in relation to material, the materialism idea. Um, what where does that idea
Mhm.
come from, that it's not real enough?
So I think that is playing off of Lewis a little bit. I don't know if he says those exact words, but playing with the idea that when we deny the spiritual world, what we're actually doing is denying at least half, if not more than half, of reality,
Mm,
right? And to see something, even something like a tree, and only say, well, all that is the cells that it's made up of, the sunlight that hits it, that
mm,
then it uses to create cell. Like that's all it is. You're reducing it down to that. You're stripping it of at least half of its reality, if not more, right? And which means that it's really less real than if you see it and you see something that is created by God. You see the wonder in it, that this thing takes in starlight, right? The sun is a star, right? It takes in starlight, and then weaves it into more trees and a forest and homes for the birds. And like this is actually amazing what is happening here, and that it was created by God to do that, and that this tree is more than the sum of its parts. There's more going on there than just, and we see that in scripture. I mean, how many verses are there about trees? And I mean, we could probably write a whole theology just through trees, like looking at trees. And there's symbolism, there's imagery, there's symbolism, there's meaning. And even if we try to deny that, it really is impossible to, because we are created in such a way that we use this all the time. We use metaphors, we use imagery, we tell stories to communicate ideas. And so if we're trying to say, well, I want to have a realistic view of reality, and I'm going to say that all reality is just material, what you've done is you've actually made it anemic. You've thinned it out. You've made it
mm,
less vibrant, less real, less solid than if you acknowledge that there's a whole other half of reality here. So that's one element. And the other element is to Lewis plays around with this idea a little bit, I think, in Mere Christianity, that of, again, fighting kind of against the Gnostics, who then want us to go all
mm,
spirit and no body, that reality, that the physical world is actually, in a sense, not as solid as it will be. So he makes a comment about when Christ in his post-resurrection body walks through the wall, and comes into the upper room, and he walks through the wall, that's not because he was a ghost. We know he's not a ghost because he even has Thomas, feel his side, and right, he eats and he drinks and he
mm,
touches things, and so the Gospels make it very clear that he is not a ghost, right? He has a
mm,
resurrected body and it's solid. And so Lewis says, well, then how could he walk through the wall? Well, it's not because he was a ghost; it's because the wall was a ghost. It's his
mm,
post-resurrection body, and our resurrection bodies are going to be more solid, more weighty, more physical, more real than they currently are. And so there's that element too. It's sort of a kind of almost reverse Platonism, like kind of an idea that so he's holding these two things together. We can't reduce everything down just to the material, because that thins the world out,
mm,
and we also can't reject reality, or reject material, because that thins the world out in a different way, right? So holding those two things together, I think, is part of what gives Lewis such a robust view of reality that really is attractive and makes us just love reading what he has to say and the worlds that he creates, because it is attractive to us, right? Because that's how actually it's keying into something that's fundamentally true about reality and about our nature as human beings. Again, we're created to be body and spirit. We're both together, and those both of them are broken. Both of them are marred by the fall and by our sin nature. But the process of the process of sanctification, and the goal of all reality is to restore that, right? That's why Christ came, was to restore us to that which we were created for. So that was maybe again a longer answer than you were looking for, but I think that is that's what that phrase was getting at there. And again, I think that might have been me imitating Lewis, quoting Lewis, possibly. Can't remember exactly where that was.
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head where that quote actually came from, but I thought that was an interesting idea. Now, one other thing that you bring up in the book is that Lewis was that this series had some connection with Dante as well. Give us a little bit of information on that. How do you mean?
So Dante, well, Lewis loved Dante. He says, I think at one point he even says he's, in his opinion, the greatest poet that there has been. So he had a very, very keen enjoyment of the Divine Comedy, especially, and it played a huge role also actually in his conversion. He read Paradiso, which is the third volume. He read that when he was kind of on the cusp of becoming a Christian, right? He was kind of in that fighting against it stage, and it really did play a keen role there in pushing him over the edge. So he clearly loved Dante, and again, as I said earlier, Lewis is one of those people that, I mean, he can't not be influenced by the authors that he loved. He is a product of every author that he read, and you can see that through all of his books, especially his fiction. Though it's hard to read any page without coming across something where you're like, oh, I think that's a reference to this other book, this other old book. So he's infused with these works of literature, and so it comes out. That's what comes out. That's what's inside. So that's what comes out. And so the trilogy, I will be really, really simplistic and say what keyed me on to comparing the Ransom Trilogy to Dante's Divine Comedy was two things mainly, and they seem really, really simplistic because they are. And then I dug further, and it was like, oh wait, this is actually a thing. The first one was, well, there are 3 books, and there are 3. Seems really stupid, but I was like, but I had also been reading the Divine Comedy, and so it was kind of like, well, there's 3 and 3. I wonder. And then the first book, the beginning of the book, Lewis calls Ransom. He introduces him by calling him the pedestrian with a capital P. And he only calls him that in the first paragraph of the first book. And after that, he gives him his name, and he never calls him the pedestrian ever again. And he calls him the pedestrian, capital P, and he starts out in a dark wood and sees a light on the hill. And as soon as I read that, I'm like, this feels like the opening of Inferno. Because the very beginning of Inferno starts out with the pilgrim, capital P, in a dark wood, and he sees a light over the hill, and that's how it starts. And so it was that kind of connection. I was like, well, it's very clearly an echo, right? He is, whether consciously or not, this is Dante. And from there, it was just a matter of kind of just unpacking that. Like, well, what if the first book sort of maps onto Inferno, and what if the second book maps onto Purgatory, and the third Paradise, and how does that look, and how does that unfold? And I just was having a conversation the other day, actually, with a Dante scholar. He's published a new translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, and we were unpacking this for like an hour and a half. So there's a lot that could be said here about the comparisons between the two. But the more he was talking about these insights into the Divine Comedy, the more I kept thinking, oh, it's like this in the Ransom Trilogy, and like this in the Ransom Trilogy. So it's not a one-to-one correlation, but they do map onto each other. So if you enjoy Dante and Divine Comedy, then hopefully that can renew an appreciation for Ransom, and vice versa. If you like the Ransom trilogy and you're not familiar with Dante, Dante is excellent. He takes some work. I mean, he's a medieval Renaissance Italian poet, and so you have to read you're going to read a translation probably. So looking into various translations there. I always say my number one recommendation for someone, if they've read an old book and didn't really like it, is to check if it's a translation, and then maybe try reading a different translation, because I've had it happen a number of times where I read something and didn't really enjoy it, or I thought I didn't. And it turns out that I really just needed to try a different translation of it, and found the one that just made it come alive, because translations make a big difference. But yeah, the Divine Comedy is definitely one of those key works that was very influential in Lewis's life and definitely in his writings. And he very clearly imitates Dante at some very, very key moments throughout the Ransom Trilogy.
Now, is there anything specific about the Ransom Trilogy that maybe you think stands out above all the others that we haven't kind of discussed yet? Is there some little key that we've missed in our conversation so far?
That's a really good question. I think we've hit a lot of what makes it unique. I mean, the medieval cosmology is huge. That is a really unique thing that Lewis is doing that I don't know has been done in any more modern literature. The older poets, the older writers, Dante himself, that was just the air they breathed. That was the world they were in. This is what everyone thinks and understands about the cosmos. And so, of course, you're going to write with that as your backdrop. But in terms of, post-Copernican revolution, I don't know that anyone else has tried to do what Lewis has done with the medieval cosmology. So that's definitely the big E on the eye chart in terms of this is important for understanding and appreciating the trilogy more. I beyond that, I think we've honestly hit a lot of the things.
Okay. Well, since you mentioned the cosmology one last time, I did want to bring something up that I thought was interesting that I had not heard before, because I've run into some people who are geocentrists, which, in the Christian nerd world gets really weird. And I don't buy into that, but it exists. It's a thing. There are whole documentaries about it. But for most of those geocentrists, the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe makes it super important. But what I heard in your book was that in that medieval cosmology, the Earth being the center of the universe made it kind of the least important. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is true. So
why does that? How does that affect how we look at that idea in general, and how that plays into the Ransom Trilogy?
Yes. So once again, I would point anyone to the discarded image, because Lewis talks about this idea, comes out very strongly in that book. So he talks about it there. But one prime example of this is actually Dante's Inferno. So if you've ever read Inferno, hell is shaped like a cone, an ice cream cone, kind of leading down, and you have the circles then going around. So it really is an ice cream cone. And as you move down to the center of the cone, and which is at the center of the earth, right? It's kind of in the side of the earth, and then the center is down at the bottom. Yeah. And so the center of the earth, which is at the center of the cosmos. So you would think the center of the center surely is like the most important spot, right? Well, when you get down there, what's at the center? Well, it's Satan himself. And the three, Judas Iscariot, Cassius, Caius, and Brutus. So Cassius and Brutus are from of Julius Caesar fame. They are the two that conspired against Caesar to have him assassinated, and then Judas Iscariot, the traitor to Christ. So those three men, who are the worst traitors to their lords, at least that's what they were considered to be, are down at the center with Satan. and Satan, I think, is chewing on one of them or something. I don't know. It's very, very exciting. Very interesting. So by that reasoning, though, if you're saying the center is the most important part of reality, whatever's at the center is that's the important place, then what you're saying is, well, then is Satan the most important being in the cosmos? It doesn't make any sense. And in the medieval mindset, though, it would have made perfect sense, because what they're seeing it is as the least important, the place of the most shame and insignificance, because the heaven of heavens, the abode of God, is outside the last sphere, right? God is actually outside, and so the center would be the farthest removed from God himself. That's as far as you can get. And what does that make the Earth then? The Earth being the center of all of the planets. Well, we're the most insignificant. We're the sump pump of the universe, right? We're down here at the bottom of this tiny little well down in the dregs, and we're looking up at the openness, right? At this huge, vast hall of light, and we're on the outside, right? We've been cast out, and so the idea, again, is a common misconception that the medievals hate, the whole story about Galileo, that the church basically couldn't have him messing with the cosmology because it messed with the theology, is actually a little bit skewed. The problem was that the church had already capitulated to the science of the day. They tied themselves so tightly to the science. It was all politics at that point, right? It's like, well, we can't deny this because we've put so much money towards all of these scientists that are doing all this work over here with this current cosmology. And it wasn't that, we can't have man not be the center because that messes with our theology of mankind being really important. It was, if we will lose a lot of money, it's always the money. We will lose a lot of money if we start changing our ideas of reality now. And so that was the problem. Problem wasn't primarily theological. It was political and money. So that's a little side rabbit trail, but so the idea that, so actually what Lewis says in The Discarded Image is that the struggle for a medieval Christian was more that how to reconcile mankind's insignificance, his utter insignificance, with the incarnation. Is that it blew their mind. How in the world could Christ become a man when we are just so far removed? That would be like him coming down. He's removing himself entirely from the Father, as far down as you can go. And that was the struggle. The struggle was not that they saw mankind as being super, super important. The struggle was that they were so unimportant. How in the world could this even happen? So it's not just that we're tiny little ants. We're miserable tiny little ants down in the deepest, darkest crack in the sidewalk. And how could God take on our flesh and actually dwell among us? That was the kind of incoherence that they saw, and they had to struggle with and get over in their view of the cosmos. So that, I think that is, again, an important distinction, though, because it does help to understand why then the cosmology is important when it comes to the Ransom Trilogy, and how that distinction comes into play. One interesting just side note too, though, is that Lewis doesn't actually use the geocentric model in the trilogy. So he draws a lot of the medieval cosmological ideas, facets, kind of little tidbits. But in the actual structure of the cosmos, he still is treating it as a solar system with the sun at the center. That comes out near the end of Out of the Silent Planet. Ransom comes across one of the creatures of Melicandra is carving out like a picture of the cosmos. He's doing sort of a diagram. And when he goes through the order of the planets, it's very clear that the sun is in the middle. Or the sun is at the center. The way he's done it, the sun is at the middle. So I think that's Lewis's little nod, like, okay, we're not going too far. We're not taking everything and saying that everything, he's not trying to convince us that the medieval cosmology is true in all of its aspects, and that the earth really is the center, all of that. So he's basically saying, how can we wed some of the key elements of that model together with our solar centric system.
Mm.
So anyway, so that, yeah, I think I'm glad you brought that up though, because that is a key element. I think it was really important and really important also even just to understanding a little more of the medieval mindset and
Mhm.
some of the things that may not have made sense about some of the medieval literature or the things that happened. It kind of brings other things into focus too, and it helps us to understand like what was actually going on in their minds when the Copernican system came along. It wasn't primarily a huge theological issue. It was more political than anything. So
Interesting. Well, what things do you have on the horizon? What are you working on next?
thanks for asking. Yeah, I currently am working on digging into another one of Lewis's works. I think that is a little bit maybe underrepresented, at least
Okay.
in the works that have been done about it. But that is his book "Till We Have Faces," which is it's a standalone novel, fiction novel. It's kind of a retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth from Greek mythology. It's a really interesting book. I think I love it. He thought it was his best novel, which is, again, makes you kind of sit up, take notice. And it's another one where there's just not a lot out there written about it, and I'm really fascinated by it, and just the process of researching and writing is really really fun. So I'm in the thick of that. So I don't want to even say like when it might be done, because I don't want to break any promises. So it's definitely in the middle of things right now. Yeah, and then I'm hoping at some point in the near future to break into the fiction world. I have a novel kind of waiting in the wings to see what will happen with that. So that was, writing fiction was actually my first love. My first foray into writing at all was I thought I was going to write novels and be a novel writer. And so it cracks me up sometimes that like this is where I am. I'm writing pure nonfiction right now, but I do love writing fiction as well. And so we'll see what happens with that in the future.
Well, when we're getting closer to a release date, definitely let me know. We'll have you back on the show, and we'll talk about them.
Definitely. Thank you.
Well, Christiana, it has been amazing having you on the show today. I've loved our conversation. You have definitely given me a new appreciation of the Space Trilogy, the Ransom Trilogy. And it makes me want to go read it again to see if I can either see those connections more, or maybe just have a better appreciation of what it is for what it is versus what I thought it was supposed to be when I first read it. Because it had come so highly recommended, and then upon the first reading, I was so initially disappointed in it. But I think it's because I had envisioned what I thought it was supposed to be, and that wasn't it. But you have definitely given me a new way to look at it and a new appreciation for it.
Well, that's good. I'm glad. That's the goal. If it makes you want to go back and read Lewis again, then I've accomplished my goal. So,
if people want to find out more about you or about your book, where can they find you?
Yeah, I have. So I do have a Facebook author page as Christiana Hale author. I also have an Instagram author page, same handle, Christiana Hale author. Both I try to update when there's big things happening. I am woefully bad at regular updates, but you can check those out. There's any new interviews or fun things that are happening. I usually try to update there. Also, you can find the book at deeperheaven.com, as well as on Amazon or other places that you buy books. So.
Awesome. Well, and I'll put links down in the show notes below. So if you're listening or watching and want to find out more, definitely go check out all those links. Christiana, it was fantastic having you on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
It has been great getting to know Christiana. If you missed the first half of the interview, make sure you go back and listen to last week's episode. And don't forget to check out the links in the show notes below to follow Christiana. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, just click all those links down there. That way you will be informed anytime we put out new content. You can find all of our social links and links to the YouTube channel and to our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. If you enjoy the show and want to help even more, consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. All of our levels have great benefits, and it makes a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will also get to hear exclusive stories of believers we're serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or to partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianNerdsUnite or ChristianNerdsUnite.com and click support in the menu. And don't forget to check out our ChristianNerdHQ.com for more great podcasts just like this one. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from 1 Thessalonians 5. May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. We'll see you next week. Blessings.
Hey